Hi, welcome to Unmuted, where I have candid connectivity conversations with industry experts. Today's expert is telecom veteran Vish Nandlall. Vish is here to discuss the story of 6G, a story you say is falling flat a little bit. So let's start there. You've argued previously that every mobile generation had a clear economic story, but 6G doesn't. What would it take for 6G to have a business model as compelling as 3G or 4G has?
I mean, 3G and 4G worked because there was an obvious mass scale customer need. 3G brought us the mobile internet and the app economy, and 4G, subsequently brought in the smartphone revolution as well as streaming video. And when I look at 6G, it doesn't seem to have that clarity as yet. I think 6G needs a problem that needs to be solved at global scale. That could be ultra precise wireless sensing. It could be deterministic 1 millisecond links for robotics. But there needs to be some kind of capability that has a proven demand. Now, I think, unfortunately, most of that demand typically gets created outside of telcos, and telcos themselves capture very little of the upside. We may repeat history again, but I still don't see that evolving 6G global demand as yet. I think the second capability is that it does need some form of economic differentiation, not just technical. Many of the existing substitutive technologies like Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7, private 5G, they all already address a lot of the different enterprise pain points that are out there. So 6G has to come up with something that's cheaper, more reliable, more secure at scale. As I stand today, I just don't see where the monetization is going to come from. I don't think that 6G needs a YouTube consumer moment. It may just need to survive on more several enterprise scales markets, like it could be utilities, defense, or some kind of automotive market. It's going to be less glamorous, but potentially more realistic as a business model.
Right. And it's also no secret that 5G has its own issues, right? And your analysis shows 5G barely cleared its cost of capital. We're still trying to figure out what, the ROI for 5G is going to be. And we're already talking about 6G. So as we continue talking about 6G, what lessons should operators take from that when planning capital allocation for 6G?
Yeah, I mean, 5G, I conveniently kind of flipped over because even its economic value was a little off center. It certainly advertised mobile edge compute as being the primary value creation, but at the end of the day, that was deferred because of the SA NSA bifurcation that happened in standards, and really what 5G proved out as a commercial vehicle was fixed wireless access. That kind of confusion isn't great for markets. If we want 6G to pay back, it can't be purely on consumer ARPU. We are really going to need to be disciplined as an industry. Competition definitely makes it hard to be disciplined. Even with weak returns, operators kept investing in spectrum and coverage to avoid falling behind their rivals. So there is, dynamics that aren't necessarily just, capture consumer attention that's at play here. There is a risk of falling behind in the outer years of deployment. I think we've got to avoid these bets like millimeter wave, for instance. That was very costly for Verizon, was slow to monetize. T-Mobile came out with their mid-band and they had a stronger ROI as a result. So, we need to deploy where the economics line up. And then I think, operators really need to get some new discipline levers, infrastructure sharing, stage rollouts tied to proven revenue, things like investing in software platforms that have faster payback. The lesson is not spend less, but tie your spending tightly to revenue visibility. If the big promises of 6G, things like AI native services or precise location, if they don't show clear willingness to pay, we're going to have to defer CapEx.
Great. And something else that is notable about 6G is the 3GPP's decision to reuse 5G's OFDM interface, right? So this means that 6G is more of a software evolution. Do you see that as a long-term advantage or a risk to adoption and branding?
Yeah, it's one of those horrible analyst answers. It's both. I think the advantage is that migration will be cheaper. Enterprises are going to benefit from having an ecosystem that doesn't have to reinvent the chipsets. They won't require radical redesign. The risk here is the branding problem. If 6G is just going to be 5G with software upgrades, customers aren't going to pay a premium. And I think we're still, hyperscalers and cloud native vendors are the ones who are better positioned to capture software value. And telcos are largely going to be relegated to the commodity transport layer. This is what effectively happened was the shift to Open Ring. So I think the safe view here is that it's going to buy breathing room. It's not going to substitute for a tangible value story. If there's not a flagship capability that the market recognizes, 6G is still going to stall as a brand.
Something else that you've also talked about previously, or written about, I should say, is kind of this save money, make money, high risk technologies. There's like three categories of tech. Among those three, so again, save money, make money versus high risk, which do you believe has the strongest chance of scaling commercially and why? And maybe add a little bit of detail about what you meant by some of those, just to give context.
Sure. I definitely think that the save money technologies will scale because they're going to improve operator margins as long as the cost to implement these technologies don't, overrun the benefits that they provide. But to your point, the best commercial scaling bet is going to be private and enterprise networks with some form of edge compute integration. And I think, the clear bottom line here is that enterprises are just willing to pay for SLAs. They're willing to pay for security. They're willing to pay for IT integration into their IT systems. There's real recurring demand here. Again, the risk here is that operators may not capture most of the margins. Certainly if I look into areas like Germany, many enterprises are licensing spectrum directly. They're bypassing the MNOs. There's other technologies like CBRS here in the US, which also allow a leapfrog of the traditional role of the MNO as the access to spectrum. The question is how agile are the hyperscalers going to be to bundle telco connectivity with cloud, effectively, relegating the role of telcos to the bit pipes. I think the realistic commercial outcome at scales is not going to be, the blockbuster new revenue streams, but kind of more of a gradual layering of enterprise revenue and cost savings. And the scaling is probably going to come from many small vertical wins rather than one global consumer story.
Yeah, it's never the flashy, exciting stuff, is it?
As much as we would like.
Yeah, I know. So, in this story of 6G economics, you have highlighted spectrum as perhaps the single biggest lever. How do you see regulators balancing licensed mid-band demand with Wi-Fi's push for more unlicensed spectrum that we've been hearing about, right?
Yeah. It's a hard trade-off. The question here is, am I going to maximize auction revenue or am I going to maximize innovation? In practice, I think regulators are going to split the baby. They'll have some licensed mid-band for wide area mobile broadband. They're going to have local shared models like CBRS in the US for enterprises and campuses, and they're going to expand on license. They will do that. I think the question is, what's the balance between political outcomes and the purely technical ones? If you look in the C-band auctions, for instance, that was $81 billion into the US Treasury. And clearly, regulators still prioritize operators' coffers. We are seeing good traction with the enterprise and CBRS markets. I think the wild card here comes back to that original question is spectrum a public good that's going to foster innovation, or is it treasury income? And I think, we'll have to see what the tail of the tape reveals over time. I think it will likely be a balance of the two.
Yeah. As the Gs have evolved, so have private networks and what they can offer, right? We've had private LTE, private 5G, but private networks, like they're kind of positioned as both an opportunity and a threat to operators. Do you think 6G standards are being shaped with enterprises truly in mind and their ability, to get that from operators, if you will? Or is it still just with MNOs first?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I've learned over the course of many, many years, is that standards, aren't necessarily neutral. There is still some bias in standards because they codify, how power is shaped, who's maximizing rents, how is the revenue flowing. The bottom line, I think, for a lot of the 3GPP standards is that they assume spectrum access is still through national carriers. So, when I think of enterprise and the MNO opportunity, yeah, operators could still manage services. They can bundle 6G with edge compute and security. They could easily do that. Enterprises and the hyperscalers could bypass them. I think the thing that's going to decide the game is not just standards, but it's going to be, where does procurement integration power shape the market? My experience has been enterprises are just going to follow anyone who simplifies deployment. And that could be MNOs, it could be SIs, it could be hyperscalers. Each of them are going to prove itself out and the market will decide. So, I'm taking out my popcorn and I want to see how the fight's going to shape up. I do think that there's an opportunity here for MNOs, but I don't think it's, as obvious a winner here.
Okay. And not to, harp too much on this whole story metaphor of 6G, but you've also said that 6G risks becoming a cautionary tale, I think, as we talked about a little bit here. What signals would convince you that the industry is on the right path?
Yeah, I think that we were probably too wrapped up, particularly in 5G on demos and pilots. And I think they can be very misleading indicators. To me, what you want to look out for is scaled, repeatable revenue. And not just one operator doing one thing. T-Mobile did a number of different network slicing demos proving out that technology, but we still have big question marks as to whether that's something that's commercially viable. I think what you want to see is, is there a number of operators, let's say greater than 20% of operator revenues in a market coming from some kind of SLA-based service, not just plain connectivity. And that would, certainly give me an indicator that something is getting traction, that there's a willingness to pay. I'd also look at ecosystem convergence. What's happening with the coordination between device, apps, and spectrum policy? Are they all aligned so that 6G isn't just an operator-driven standard? And then I'd also take a look at the cost curve. Is the cost per bit delivered falling fast enough to create margin room for new services? I'll go back to the negative signal, which was millimeter wave and 5G. There was lots of hype. There was flashy demos, but deployments stayed niche because the economics didn't work. So 6G has to avoid repeating that same trap.
Okay. And looking across like 3G to 5G, do you feel like the era of mobile generations as consumer-led revolutions is over? And I mean, I know that in 5G, the branding and the commercials certainly tried to imply that this was for consumers as well, but we also know that consumers kept kind of saying, I'm not seeing a big difference. But of course, that was not true with 4G. 4G was a big deal for consumers. So I don't know, where do you position 6G here? Is it destined to be an enterprise first technology? And is that kind of the direction we're headed?
Yeah, I mean, the framing of any technology needs to have some situational awareness. Like, what are the conditions in the market? I think the economic table was set for 3G and 4G. We were still, following the adoption curve in terms of penetration, particularly in North America. When 4G came around, we suddenly had this smartphone and there was a new technology layering that needed to occur from feature phone to smartphone. And that started to drive a lot of the revenue through the upgrades in the data plans. But we kind of don't have those same economic conditions in the era of 5G and or 6G. Most of the population has been penetrated. So I think we're at a point where the enterprise first is more plausible, just simply because consumer broadband demand is saturated. At the end of the day, to the point of many, many consumers, latency speed isn't that much of a concern. Most of the apps and behaviors that consumers have can be completely satisfied with the current bit rates and latency. Now, enterprises do have clear ROI around latency and speeds, particularly for things like automation and safety. So it does seem like a much more plausible bet. It's also much more difficult. It doesn't scale in a global way. It scales less horizontally and more vertically. And that's a harder slog. So I think the revenue story is going to a little bit more lumpy. And it may require, a couple or maybe three verticals to really tell the story of whether 6G is taking off or not. That's going to be difficult to follow. Having said that, I do think there's a counterpoint here because history is always warning us that you shouldn't declare the consumer dead. If there's a breakthrough device like Meta's advertising their mass market AR glasses, certainly Apple may conceive of something equally as compelling. AI companions are starting to, kind of hit the zeitgeist with OpenAI acquiring Jony Ive's company. So there's things that are brewing that could create a consumer wave. Now, The safe money is that it's enterprise first. Let's call that the base case. I think the upside case is, yeah, there's a new consumer device platform that is so compelling that it creates another new tsunami that reignites demand. The downside is that both are going to flop, and 6G becomes an incremental cost focused upgrade. So I don't like, giving a black and white vision of how this can manifest. I think the safe money is on enterprise first.
Okay. Yeah. You calling the 6G story lumpy it's good. It's a good visualization. I like that. All right. Well, Vish, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
It was great talking to you, Catherine. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
you too. And I'll see everyone next week.